2 days ago, there's an article in the Jewish Forward, J. Michelson, an exceptionally well-written article, very potent, albeit succinct. And the essence of the article is about creeping Jewish fundamentalism in our midst. That's the title of the article. And I'm actually surprised that no one has written about this thus far. This is a quite common phenomenon that has been going on for years. And he talks about ultra-orthodoxy just creeping into the Jewish fabric and becoming more and more common and becoming more and more accepted, if not espoused, by the mainstream. So the mainstream, essentially what he's arguing is that the mainstream is just sitting silently by and watching how these events unfold and just basically saying, well, I might not agree with everything they're saying, but I'm certainly not going to go out on a limb to dispute their portrayal of what Judaism is and present my view. Because, I mean, after all, they seem to be more authentic Jews than I am, and so who am I to refute their version of Judaism? So that's essentially how he describes what's happening. And this is a very, very accurate description. And he compares the situation among the Orthodox to among what's happening with the Christians. And he says that among the Christians, the fundamentalist Christians disavow affiliation. The moderate Christians disavow affiliation from fundamentalists, and he says that the same thing should be happening among the Orthodox. They should categorically and emphatically disavow any affiliation and any sympathy with the cause of the ultra-Orthodox. And they should and he further emphasizes that they should recognize it as a threat to the survival of Judaism. And this is a very important point that he makes, which is that when you take a view to an extreme, to the point that it's not sustainable, then it's actually a threat to your agenda. And I have actually an interesting example of this. He mentions Iran. He cites that as a country where the fundamentalists have taken over, and now the moderates are beleaguered, and they're basically just staying quiet because the fundamentalists are in control. And also the same pattern. You have a creeping overtaking of the fundamentalism. And but I actually have a different analogy, and that is North Korea. And right now I'm in China, of course, and so China is, it's considered a communist country, of course. It's still the party that is control of government is still called, even to this day, still called the Communist Party, though in fact the country is no longer a communist. The economic system here is no longer communist, and in many ways it's actually even more capitalist than America. But I'm digressing. That's not my point. My point is that the relationship between China and North Korea nowadays is one in which the Chinese have come a far way from classical communism, and yet when it comes to the North Koreans, who are arguably the only surviving communist state, truly communist state in the world, when it comes to North Korea, they have this feeling: oh, I can't oppose them, I can't publicly denounce them, or disown them. I can't do that because, after all, I'm communist too, right? And yet, North Korea and China is actually realizing this, that North Korea is a threat to communism, and it actually taints and mars the image of communism. Because if that's what communism is, if that's the presentation of what communism is all about, it's an authoritarian and oppressive government, and one in which knowledge is suppressed. If that's what communism stands for, then of course everyone is going to look down upon it, and everyone is going to say, this is crazy, this is ridiculous. And so the Chinese want to be involved, they want to make progress, and so they're basically torn between, on the one hand, standing by a country that has a political system of which they partook in the past, and they were very proud of in the past, and on the other hand, recognizing that they are so isolationist and so oppressive and so incompatible with modernity that you no longer want to be associated with them. And I think that over time, China is leaning in the direction of disassociating themselves from them. And I think that's the same that should be happening among the mainstream Jews. That they should basically say that they'll no longer support ultra-orthodoxy, and no longer sympathize, and no longer sit silently by while they do their thing. So Jay Michelson in the article, so he talks about the ultra-orthodox gaming the system. So of course this is something that I'm intimately familiar with. I grew up ultra-orthodox, and I know of course that they try to milk the system, milk the money that the government is willing to give them, and this is of course because of various flaws in the way that the political establishment is configured, in that special interest groups that cling together and fortify themselves are able to extract a lot of concessions from governmental players because they vote as a bloc, and they are very loyal, and it's easy to acquire them by making promises and delivering. And here's the other thing. Here's the other important thing. Nobody is going to oppose a politician who caters to the special interest, because he's just basically saying, I'm a nice guy. I'm basically, if you want something, come and make your claim. I'll deliver to you too. So people are making this fundamental error in not recognizing that it's a zero-sum game. That the more you give to one special interest, the less there is left over to another special interest, and actually even more importantly, to the mainstream. Okay, but people don't recognize that, and this is why, for example, unions are so strong, and all these problems that municipal governments are having with the pension system is because of this. Because nobody is going to. I mean, the average person is not going to say, I'm opposed to a fireman retiring in comfort and in luxury after 20 years. He's a public servant, right? Why should? But in reality, this is completely unsustainable. It's ridiculous. The kind of pensions that they promised, that the city promised, the money just wasn't there. So forget about morality and whether it is correct in terms of what is morally correct, how we should reward our public servants. Forget about that. Just think whether this adds up, whether 2 + 2 = 4, whether the money is in the coffers to give them all those promised benefits. And it just isn't there. So basically, people are promising and pretending that it works when in fact it doesn't. And the same thing is happening here. You have the mainline Orthodox who are basically standing on the sideline and saying, okay, we profess Judaism, they profess Judaism, we have maybe minor differences here and there, but more or less we're both Jewish, and such. But that's not the case. Because the ultra-Orthodox version, there's a very fundamental difference between the ultra-Orthodox and the mainline Orthodox. I mean, obviously everyone knows that the gap has been widening, but in addition to that, there's a fundamental difference between the way they approach Judaism. Okay, in the mainstream, Judaism is considered an additional enhancement to a well-rounded life in America. So you're gleaning whatever you can from the system in order to enhance whatever values you can, and you are in control over what to take, what to appropriate, and what to discard. Whereas for the ultra-Orthodox, they believe and they relish the subservience of the individual to authority and to ancient teachings, none of which they are able to assess and validate themselves. And that's what they want. They don't want to be in control. They're basically giving up control. They don't want to think, and they don't want to analyze any laws. And these are not even laws. These are just perceived laws. These are pseudo-laws that have been reconstructed to create and to configure the essence of what is modern Orthodoxy. And in their image, in their vision, this is how traditional Jews behaved 300 years ago, but it's not. But it's not the case. This is just a reactionary practice to all that progress that humanity and Jews have made in the last 200-300 years. And so basically you have a people here who have a fundamentally different approach to Judaism. So for them, Jewish values isn't something that enhances a well-rounded human individual. Rather, that is the basis for their life, and it cannot be questioned. Okay, and when that is perceived as incompatible with any other value, then the authority and the tradition, however unreasonable, however incompatible it is, that's going to trump, and it's going to carry the day. And that's the real threat that we're dealing with here. Now, another point that he makes is that they should start supporting groups like Footsteps, who are actively involved in trying to help people who are leaving the system. So this is also a very important point, of course. Now, personally, unfortunately, I wasn't able to benefit from Footsteps. I'm also an OTD. I left, meaning I left ultra-orthodoxy. I left 14 years ago in 1999. And at that point, of course, there was no Footsteps. To my knowledge, I was, the first cohort, so to speak, of leaving in the modern age, like in the new millennium, if you will. And when I left, I wasn't aware of anyone else who was in the same boat. And so this is why, for me, it was tremendously, exceptionally difficult, the process of leaving. And, I cannot even, I don't want to digress, but I went through many ordeals, and even to this day, I still feel that in so many ways, things could have gone better if I had more support and more moral support, especially, but also financially. Okay, so both of these are very important, and this is where mainstream Jewry can step in. Moral support. I want to see rabbis in the pulpit. I want to see them talk about this. I don't want to see them just reinforce Jewish values without cautioning against what happens when you overuse and when you employ those values. Okay, moderation, how to properly deploy those values. That's what should be included in every sermon and every talk about a Talmudic saying, for example, right? You want to point out the pearls of wisdom in that saying, but you also want to point out what it's not saying and the limitations of that, and how, if that is contradictory with anything that we know from science, point that out. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be ashamed. Be honest, and don't support a system that is just not that just doesn't hold water. So that's one thing. And secondly, financially, okay, there's huge financial reserves in the Jewish philanthropic system, and a lot of this is placed in, of course, naturally, in the direction of reinforcing Jewish values, and that's great. Again, I have nothing against that. Obviously, that's the purpose of the money. That's why they're donating it. But at the same time, how are you really going to support Jewish values if you're going to support fundamentalist values? Because they are not compatible with your values. They are not compatible with any of your values, let alone your Jewish values. They're not compatible with your basic, fundamental American values of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of thinking. Freedom of thinking. In my community, there isn't the freedom to think because the community is so tight-knit that if you think outside the box, you're already, in your mind, you're already ostracized. This is how mind-numbing and oppressive the system is. And so we need to support them, and we need to actively seek out. Oh, and another point that I want to make is that there are now hundreds of people who have left, and they need to go out of their way to integrate them into mainstream, and I haven't seen that happen so far. So we need to make them feel comfortable. And again, there's many limitations. They don't come equipped with a kind of secular knowledge that an average American, an average Jewish person has. And so sometimes when they seek to join that mainstream American Jewish communities, they stick out like a sore thumb in their behavior. They don't have the etiquette, and there's large gaps in their knowledge of just American lore and just basic American culture. And sometimes, and I'm telling you this from my personal experience, I've had various situations. I went on what's it called, on Birthright. This was a huge fiasco on my Birthright trip. I was straight out of the community, and people were mocking me left and right, and I was just lost, completely lost. I had no help at all. Okay, so this is just an example of nobody cared about what it is, what is the real purpose of this. Okay, the real purpose of this is not just to enhance Jewish values, but it is to build a system that is sustainable. And if you can't bridge the gap between somebody who's just left a fundamentalist, ultra-orthodox background and somebody who's coming from a secular background, okay, if you can't bridge the gap, then what's the point? What's the point of such a program? And so more integration and more sensitivity to people coming from such a background would be much appreciated.